In the modern world, choosing what to wear is often a deeply personal expression. From the fabric we choose to the cut of our clothes, what we wear might tell others who we are, how we feel, or what we want to be seen as. But in the Middle Ages, clothing was not just personal, it was political. More than that, it was regulated, controlled, and sometimes even punishable by law. These laws were known as sumptuary laws, and they might be one of the most quietly humiliating aspects of life in medieval society. Because when the wrong pair of shoes could get you fined, and wearing too many buttons was suspicious behavior, life began to feel a little restrictive at their core. Sumptuary laws were rules designed to enforce social hierarchies through appearance. They dictated what people could wear, eat, and own based on their social class, gender, and profession. Want to wear fur? Better be a noble. Thinking of donning purple? You better have royal blood. Even the length of your shoes, the width of your sleeves, and the number of jeweled rings on your fingers were matters of public concern. These laws weren't just fashion advice, they were actual legally enforceable codes backed by fines, public shaming, or even imprisonment. In some cases, tailors could be punished simply for making clothes that were deemed too luxurious for their clients. It was a strange kind of legal overreach designed to make sure that everyone knew their place and no one dressed above their station. Let's say you were a well-off merchant in 14th century England. You were successful, made good money, and wanted to show it. So you commissioned a new cloak made from velvet and lined with miniver, a type of soft white fur. This wasn't just about comfort, it was a status symbol. But if the local officials caught you wearing it, they might remind you that velvet and miniver were reserved for knights and above. As a mere merchant, you were not allowed to appear noble. No matter how much money you had in fact. Money alone didn't buy status in the Middle Ages. You could be wealthier than a baron and still be legally forced to dress like a commoner. That was kind of the point. These laws were less about spending and more about control. They existed to make sure that the visual symbols of nobility stayed with the nobles, and the poor stayed visibly poor. One of the most infamous sets of sumptuary laws came under King Edward III of England, who issued numerous proclamations in the 14th century attempting to restore social order after the chaos of the Black Death. With so many peasants having died, laborers could demand higher wages. The result? Some commoners began to dress better than before, and that ... was unacceptable. In 1363, Edward decreed that no one below the rank of knight was allowed to wear cloth of gold, imported silk, or certain types of furs. Women were included. 2. The wives of laborers, shepherds, and other workers could only wear garments made of wool or linen, and even then, only if they were undyed and unembroidered. The fear driving these laws wasn't just about fashion, it was about maintaining the illusion of divine order. Medieval society was built on the concept of hierarchy being divinely ordained. Kings ruled by the grace of God, nobles defended the land, clergy protected the soul, and peasants worked the fields. If a farmer started looking like a lord, the whole pyramid seemed to wobble. Sumptuary laws were like visual glue desperately, trying to hold the social structure together by forcing people to dress the part they were born into. Even color wasn't safe. Certain hues were reserved exclusively for the upper classes. Purple, thanks to the difficulty of making purple dye, was considered almost sacred and could be legally restricted to royals and top-ranking nobles. Crimson and deep blues were also tightly controlled. The irony, of course, was that some of these colors were fading into popularity, not just because they looked rich, but because they were impossibly expensive to produce. Only a king could afford enough of the dye to bathe his robes in color. So the poor were stuck with muddy browns, grays, and off-whites fabric that looked like it had been rinsed in dishwater, because it often had, and it wasn't just about outerwear. Even underclothes were regulated. There were laws stating how many layers of linen a woman could wear, or how tight a man's hose could be. Tailoring became suspect when it shaped the body too much, hinting at vanity. Doublets that showed off. A man's chest too proudly might be seen as a sign of effeminacy or worse, social climbing. Let's not forget jewelry. In places like Florence, France, and England, there were detailed records of what kind of jewelry each class could wear. Gold chains, elaborate brooches, rings with gemstones, all were supposed to be worn only by people of noble birth. A rich merchant might be able to afford a diamond ring, but if he wore it in public, he could be denounced, fined, or even dragged into court for pretending to nobility. It was fashion as theater, you had to know your role. And what? About the enforcers of these rules? They weren't fashion police as we might imagine today. Instead, local magistrates or clerics often acted as enforcers. They kept an eye out for immodest or unlawful clothing. There were even public informants who could report neighbors for dressing too extravagantly. Imagine going to a market in your best cloak, only to be publicly shamed because your sleeve was 2 inches too wide, or your boots had too many brass buckles. Even weddings were not safe from sumptuary intrusion. In England and France, there were strict codes about what brides could wear depending on their class. A peasant woman might wear a wreath of flowers, but silk veils were reserved for noble women. Jewelry, dress color, embroidery, all were regulated. A common bride trying to wear a satin gown might have it confiscated by the local authorities. And then there were the loopholes. Rich merchants often found clever ways to appear fancy without technically breaking the rules. They might use expensive local fabrics dyed in muted tones, or have their clothes tailored in subtle ways to flatter the body while technically obeying the law. Others simply paid fines in advance, treating the laws like an annoying tax on luxury. It became a cat and mouse game between the rising middle class and the old guard of nobility. In some cases, sumptuary laws backfired. By restricting certain fashions to the nobility, they actually made those styles more desirable. And by attempting to suppress class mobility through fashion, they inadvertently highlighted just how fragile the social order had become. Because when a poor man's shoes look like a lord's, the difference between them starts to blur, and that in medieval Europe was dangerous. These strange rules eventually faded as the Middle Ages gave way to the Renaissance and new forms of wealth, and status emerged. But for hundreds of years, your appearance wasn't just a matter of taste. It was a legal matter tied to your birth, your job, your income, and your place in a rigid and sometimes petty social order. So next time you pull on a comfy hoodie or try out a new jacket, remember, in medieval times, you might have needed permission first, and if it looked too good, you might have ended up fined, shamed, or worse, just for trying to dress like you mattered. The rule of the bell, curfews, and silence after sunset in today's world. When the sun sets, life often just begins. Cities light up. Streets hum with traffic. Night owls go for walks, diners eat late meals, and students finish homework under fluorescent bulbs. But in medieval times, nightfall wasn't the start of anything. It was the official end of the day, a signal to go home, shut up, and stay inside. This wasn't just good advice. It was the law. The medieval world was one of noise and chaos by day, but once the sun dipped beneath the horizon, darkness didn't just bring sleep. It brought danger, paranoia, and a heavily enforced expectation of silence. In many towns and cities across Europe, this daily transition from noise to quiet was marked not by a natural moment, but by the tolling of a large, unmistakable bell, commonly known as the curfew bell. The word curfew comes from the old French phrase couvre-feu, meaning cover the fire. And yes, it was literal. When the bell rang, it signaled that every household should douse their flames, extinguish hearths, and stop all public movement. You were expected to put a lid over your fire to prevent house fires and, by extension, avoid illuminating the night in a way that attracted attention or caused alarm. But the curfew bell was more than just fire safety. It was part of a broader system of social control designed to maintain peace, keep criminal activity down, and preserve the hierarchy of medieval life. When that bell rang, it wasn't just about putting out the fire. It was about putting out the possibility of trouble. In cities like London, Paris, and Florence, the bell tolled from a church tower or town hall. It echoed across rooftops and cobbled alleys, cutting through the evening air like a command from above. People who were outside rushed to finish errands, pack up stalls, and head home before the final toll. Street vendors packed their carts. Bakers locked their doors. The clatter of feet on stone gave way to the heavy hush of a town forced to sleep. If you were caught out after the bell, unless you had a valid reason or papers, you were seen as suspicious at best, criminal at worst. Watchmen patrolled the streets and had full authority to question, detain, or beat those who loitered. There were few streetlights, no phones, and no easy way to identify who was who. So the rule was simple. If you're out late, you're up to no good. Even in rural villages, this rule applied. While there might not be a bell in a tiny hamlet, the same principle held. Sunset meant stillness. Social life was built around the rhythm of light and dark, and light, especially after hours, was tightly controlled. Candles and oil lamps were expensive and dangerous. Fires could easily spread, and whole towns had been lost to a single spark. So the night was kept quiet and dark by custom and by law. This wasn't always a gentle transition either. There are records from places like medieval York and Bruges, where town guards were known to bang doors and shout warnings during their patrols. Curfew, curfew, they'd yell. To bed, to bed. If they caught someone creeping around after hours, the punishment could range from a stiff fine to public humiliation. Or even time in the Stockstad, and the curfew bell wasn't just a nightly ritual, it could ring for other reasons too. During times of unrest or plague, bells were used to impose martial curfews, demanding silence and stillness to prevent riots or spread of disease. During these times, even opening your window or speaking aloud at night could be cause for suspicion. Entire neighborhoods might fall silent, like a town holding its breath. There was also a deeply moral angle to all of this. The medieval church preached that night was the domain of sin. Darkness was associated with temptation, witchcraft, drunkenness, and secret meetings. To be out after curfew was to place your soul in danger, not just your body. It was assumed that people wandering at night were doing things they shouldn't, gambling, drinking, fornicating, plotting, by imposing a nightly curfew. Society wasn't just protecting order. It was trying to protect your soul from nighttime corruption. This was especially true in cities. The bigger and more prosperous a city became, the more obsessed its leaders were with controlling what happened after sunset. Wealth brought more people, which brought more crime, which meant more anxiety about the night. As a result, cities passed increasingly strict curfew laws. In Paris during the 14th century, the bell was rung from the Notre Dame Cathedral every night at around 8 or 9 p.m., and the city gates were closed soon after. Anyone outside was expected to have a lantern and an escort or risk arrest. Interesting is that different people experienced the curfew differently. For the poor, curfew was unavoidable. They lived in shared homes, single rooms, or huts with no real doors or locks. They went to bed early, partly because there was nothing to do and no light to do it by. For wealthier townsfolk, the curfew was something to be worked around. Nobles might host private feasts or entertain guests after dark, but always behind. Closed doors and with plenty of staff on hand to protect them. Over time, some groups were granted exceptions. Doctors on night visits, priests performing last rites, royal messengers, and elite guards were sometimes allowed to move freely at night. But even they had to carry proof, often a wax-sealed letter, a medallion, or a signed scroll. Without it, a misunderstanding could turn fatal. After all, a man with a hood and a torch looked the same whether he was a doctor or a thief in some towns. Curfew enforcement was seasonal. Winter curfews came earlier, sometimes as early as 6 p.m., while in summer they were pushed later, closer to 9. But the core idea never changed. Nightfall was not yours to enjoy. It was a moment of obligation where the safety of the community was deemed more important than personal freedom. Even inns and taverns had to comply. If you were drinking after hours, the doors were bolted shut and curtains drawn tight. A late night mug of ale could cost you a fine if you made too much noise or let candlelight shine through the shutters. The idea of a lively midnight pub was laughable in the medieval world. Nightlife simply didn't exist. And what about travelers? Medieval travelers had a rough time with curfews. Arriving in a new city after dark was a nightmare. The gates might be closed. Inns might refuse guests. Guards might assume you were a thief. Strangers at night were treated with suspicion. You might have to sleep in a stable, barn, or roadside ditch until morning. That is, if you weren't robbed first, interestingly. This strictness created entire microeconomies around nightfall. Bell ringers were paid a stipend. Watchmen and curfew enforcers held important city jobs. Lamplighters and fire watchers worked briefly after sunset to make sure everything was secure. In wealthier cities, some households even hired private guards to patrol their property through the night, essentially buying their way out of curfew fear. But for the average person, night meant retreat. It meant locking your door, drawing your shutters, and slipping into bed without ceremony. Families often shared sleeping space, and once the fire was out, there was nothing to do but sleep or whisper quietly. Hoping no one outside would hear dot over the centuries, curfews became less rigid. As cities developed street lighting and police forces, and as night became a safer place to move around, the curfew bell faded into memory. But for hundreds of years, it was the heartbeat of the medieval evil, a slow, echoing reminder that your freedom ended when the sun went down dot today. The idea of being legally forbidden to walk at night seems absurd. But in medieval life, that bell wasn't just a sound. It was a reminder that your place in the world was not just about who you were, but about when you could be seen dot, and when the bell tolled, the message was clear. Go home. Be silent. Stay in your place. Dot no baths on holy days. When cleanliness was sinful, when we think of cleanliness today, we think of health, self-respect, and maybe even a bit of luxury. A warm shower at the end of a long day. A relaxing bath on a quiet weekend. But in the medieval world, cleanliness wasn't always a virtue. In many cases, especially on religious holidays, taking a bath could be considered downright sinful. This contradiction might seem strange at first. Why would a society that lived with mud-covered roads, chamber pots, and livestock inside the home choose to avoid bathing? And more than that, why would the church, the most powerful institution of the Middle Ages, actively discourage it, especially on days considered holy? To understand this, we need to look at how medieval Europeans understood cleanliness. Unlike the modern connection between hygiene and health, medieval cleanliness was spiritual, not medical. To be clean wasn't necessarily to be washed. It was to be pure in soul, humble in appearance, and modest in behavior. And physical cleanliness, especially when pursued for comfort or beauty, was viewed with deep suspicion. Public bathhouses, which existed all across Europe from the early Middle Ages into the Renaissance, were seen as both essential and dangerous. They were places to get clean, yes, but also places of gossip, temptation, and sometimes even sin. Men and women bathed together in some regions. Soap was shared, nudity was common, and the line between washing and indulgence was thin. To church authorities, bathhouses became suspect, not because they promoted hygiene, but because they enticed. Pleasure. The concern wasn't that people were too dirty. The concern was that they were enjoying being clean too much. Religious calendars ruled the medieval year, and nearly every week was dotted with saints' days, feast days, fast days, and moments of spiritual reflection. On these days, people were expected to deny the flesh fasting, praying, wearing rough clothing, and refraining from activities that pleased the body. Bathing in this context was viewed as a bodily indulgence, and therefore something to be avoided. Some monastic rules even included bans on bathing entirely during holy periods. Monks and strict orders might be forbidden from bathing except a few times per year, regardless of season. In 9th century Benedictine communities, a monk might be permitted one full bath per year, typically around Easter. Not only was this seen as sufficient, it was viewed as spiritually superior. The logic was brutal, but consistent. If the flesh was inherently sinful, then comforting it through hot water, scented oils, or scrubbing was a slippery slope. Better to smell a bit, suffer a bit, and stay humble. Outside monasteries, the rules varied. In some towns, public bathhouses were closed on Sundays and feast days by law. Local officials, often working under the influence of the church, decreed that no bathing should occur when people were expected to attend Mass or observe religious reflection. In 14th century Germany, laws were passed banning bathing during Lent. The idea was simple. On days when Christ suffered, you shouldn't be enjoying anything, let alone a hot soak. This led to strange contradictions. People might work themselves into a filthy sweat harvesting grain or hauling carts, but they were still legally forbidden from rinsing off on certain days. Instead, they were expected to attend church, sit quietly, and reflect not on the state of their armpits, but on the condition of their soul. What made things more complicated was the church's shifting relationship with water itself. Water had symbolic meaning. It was used in baptism, holy rites, and purification rituals. But using water for comfort, beauty, or sensual pleasure, that was another story, in fact. Church sermons from the 12th and 13th centuries occasionally condemned people who bathed too frequently. It was a sign, they claimed, of vanity and worldliness. Why waste time on appearances when your soul might be in peril? Some even argued that excessive bathing made people more vulnerable to sin because it made the body more sensitive to touch, more attuned to comfort, and therefore more prone to lust. Of course, not everyone agreed. Many physicians in the medieval Islamic world, and later in parts of Christian Europe, argued that regular bathing was necessary for health. They noted that dirt could fester in the skin, lice could breed in unwashed hair, and unclean hands spread disease. But these voices were often overshadowed by the more powerful religious voices, which saw bathhouses not as clinics, but as dens of temptation. There were even spiritual warnings. One 13th century French preacher claimed that bathing on a feast day might result in losing God's favor and even open the door to demonic influence. In some rural areas, folktales grew around the idea that bathing during Lent or on a saint's day could invite bad luck, illness, or even death. People were warned that washing themselves on such days would wash away the blessings they were meant to be receiving. So, what did people do? Well, they waited. If a major feast day was approaching, people might delay bathing until it passed. Families planned around the religious calendar. A bath before Sunday, and none for the next 3 days. Or maybe one on Thursday if the local priest wasn't too strict. Others simply gave up entirely during long periods of religious observation, relying on herbs, perfumes, or clothing changes to mask the effects. And for the poor, who lacked access to bathhouses, and often bathed in rivers or communal tubs, situation was worse. Rivers might be considered off limits on holy days, and communal tubs might be locked. The result? Entire neighborhoods went weeks without bathing. And during major feast seasons like Christmas or Easter, hygiene took a backseat to prayer, fasting, and its spiritual preparation. Of course, not everyone followed the rules. In wealthier households, especially among nobility, private bathing chambers existed. Hot water was boiled and poured into large wooden tubs, and attendants helped nobles wash in privacy. On holy days, these baths were sometimes disguised as ritual purification rather than indulgence. Nobles bent the rules while claiming piety. But for common folk, bathing on a holy day meant risking social and spiritual punishment. Over time, these ideas began to fade. By the late Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, attitudes toward bathing shifted. Influences from Islamic and Byzantine medical texts helped restore bathing's reputation. Cities built more regulated bathhouses. Personal hygiene became slowly associated with health again. But even so, the shadow of religious suspicion lingered for centuries. It's easy to mock these old ideas now. The notion that scrubbing yourself with soap could be sinful seems absurd. But to a medieval mind, the balance between body and soul was delicate. The world was filled with danger physical, yes, but more importantly, moral. And every action, even a bath, had to be weighed not against comfort, but against eternity dot. So next time you enjoy a long, steamy shower on a Sunday, remember, for a medieval peasant, that might have been the worst possible time to get clean. Guild rules, work, trade, and who could make what in the modern world. You might wake up one morning and decide to start your own business. Maybe you'll become a baker or a blacksmith or a shoemaker. You get the tools, learn the trade, maybe go online and begin. It's your life, your career, your choice. But in the medieval world, it didn't work that way. Because in medieval towns and cities, your career, what you made, how you made it, where you sold it, and how much you earned was all regulated under a system of organizations known as guilds. And while guilds offered a kind of structure and protection for workers, they also created a vast web of restrictions, rules, and rituals that could make life astonishingly rigid. At first glance, guilds might seem like a good thing. They were collectives of people who practiced the same trade: shoemakers, blacksmiths, tailors, bakers, weavers, tanners, and dozens more. In an age before trade unions or labor laws, guilds provided a sense of belonging. They protected their members from unfair competition, provided support during illness, and even helped with funeral costs. Being part of a guild meant you were someone, but beneath this protective layer was a much harsher reality. Because getting into a guild wasn't simple. You didn't just apply. You had to start as an apprentice, usually as a young boy, and serve for years under the watchful eye of a master. You worked long hours for little or no pay, often just for food and a place to sleep. You weren't allowed to marry during this time, and your life belonged to your trade. Only after years of work 5, 7, or even 10 might you become a journeyman, allowed to work for wages but still under supervision. Then, if you were very lucky, and only if the guild approved, you could submit a masterpiece, a literal demonstration of your skill to the guild. If it passed, you became a master and could finally open your own shop, but many never made it. That far, guilds weren't just about skill. They were about control. The number of masters allowed in a town was often limited. If a guild had 10 master carpenters, it might refuse to admit an 11th, not because he lacked talent, but because the guild didn't want too much competition. This meant entire generations of skilled workers could be locked out of advancement, kept forever as journeymen, unable to set prices, own tools, or pass on their trade independently. And that wasn't the only problem. Once inside a guild, your every move was regulated. Guild rules could number in the hundreds, covering everything from shop hours to materials to how wide a loaf of bread should be. In Paris, a baker might be punished for making bread that was too small. In Florence, a goldsmith could be fined for using the wrong alloy. In London, a tailor might face exile for copying a design that wasn't his. Every stitch, nail, and barrel had to meet exact specifications, and regular inspections were carried out. Guild officials could enter your shop, weigh your goods, test your fabric, and measure your candles. If they didn't like what they saw, you could be fined, censured, or expelled. And expulsion wasn't just career-ending, it was life-destroying. Without guild membership, you couldn't legally work. And then there was the geography of it all. Guilds controlled where you could set up shop. Streets in medieval cities were often divided by trade. One alley might be nothing but shoemakers. Another full of butchers. If you were a cobbler and tried to open shop in the weaver's district, you'd be shut down. The guilds maintained these boundaries with religious zeal. Violators were sometimes dragged into court, their goods confiscated, their names blackened. The guilds also enforced price fixing. A master couldn't just charge what he wanted for a chair or a cloak. Prices were set by the guild, and undercutting your competitors was forbidden. In theory, this protected consumers from being gouged. But in practice, it meant that innovation and business growth were stifled. If you found a faster way to make barrels or a cheaper way to make shoes, you weren't rewarded, you were punished. Creativity was especially dangerous. If your products stood out too much, they could be banned for being unusual or not in the custom of the guild. Some guilds had rules about colors, others about shapes. In 14th century Cologne, a shoemaker could be fined for making boots in a style that hadn't been approved by the shoemakers' council. Innovation was not the goal, conformity was. Women, too, had a rough time with the guild system. While widows could sometimes take over their husbands' businesses, they often weren't allowed full guild membership. In many towns, female labor was essential, especially in textiles, brewing, and midwifery, but guilds still tried to keep them in the margins. A woman might weave fabric for years, but be forbidden from selling it under her own name. Even if she did most of the work, her husband or son had to take the credit. And what about outsiders? Foreigners, people from other towns, cities, or countries were shut out entirely. You could be the best mason in Italy, but if you moved to Paris and tried to work without joining the local guild, you were called a false worker and hunted down. Some cities had night raids where guild officers and city guards swept through. Back alleys, looking for unauthorized laborers. Punishments ranged from fines to having your tools destroyed in front of you. Even religion played a role. Guilds often had patron saints, held mandatory religious feasts, and required members to contribute to chapel maintenance. If you didn't attend the guild's mass or refused to pay for a candle to be lit at the altar, you could be fined or excommunicated from the guild. It sounds strange. But in medieval society, being part of a guild was a kind of economic citizenship. You weren't just a worker. You were part of a brotherhood. This brotherhood gave you identity, protection, and power, but only if you followed its rules exactly. And heaven help you if you broke them. There are even records of guild members being physically attacked for crossing boundaries. A baker who used imported grain might find his oven smashed. A brewer who tried to sell too much ale might have his barrels drained in the street. Guild loyalty was enforced not just with laws, but with fear, shame, and sometimes outright violence. Of course, some people found ways to cheat the system. Black markets emerged. Unlicensed workers found secret places to trade. Traveling peddlers, who weren't tied to one city or guild, would move from town to town, selling goods quietly under the radar. But if they were caught, confiscation, beatings, exile, or worse, by the late Middle Ages. Guilds had become so powerful that city governments were often run by guild leaders. In places like Florence and Ghent, guild masters sat on councils, ran city defenses, and even controlled tax policy. What had started as a system to protect craftsmen had become a political machine, blending work, faith, and power into one tight fist. And for the average worker, that meant a lifetime of rules. What tools you could own, what patterns you could use, what prices you could charge, how early you could open, how late you could work, who you could teach, where you could walk, who you could marry. Every part of your professional life was bound up in guild law. And if you wanted freedom, well, there wasn't unless you were willing to risk everything and live outside the system. So next time you stroll through a weekend market or start a little side hustle online, remember, in the medieval world, you'd probably need a license, approval from the guild master, a patron saint blessing, and a signed charter just to sell a candle. Marriage by arrangement. Love was not a factor in modern times. Marriage is often seen as the ultimate act of personal choice. Two people fall in love, get to know one another, maybe live together, argue over chores, and eventually, if they choose, they tie the knot. But in the medieval world, that kind of romance was more likely to be found in songs and poetry than real life, because for most people, marriage was not a matter of love. It was a matter of duty, money, family strategy, and property rights, and that made it one of the strangest, most tightly controlled aspects of medieval society. To start with, the concept of arranged marriage wasn't just common, it was the norm. Children, especially daughters, were betrothed not when they were in their 20s or even their teens, but often when they were still children. A noble daughter might be promised to another noble house by the age of 7. In some cases, infants were pledged to each other before they could walk. These weren't idle agreements. They were formal contracts, witnessed, and often blessed by the church. Why so young? Because marriage wasn't about the couple, it was about the families. A good marriage could secure an alliance, bring in land, settle a feud, or boost social standing. It was a tool of diplomacy and economics, not intimacy. And once an agreement was made, it was incredibly difficult to break. In many cases, refusing a marriage proposal, even one arranged without your consent, was seen as a form of disobedience, or worse, rebellion. That meant love was irrelevant, and sometimes actively discouraged. Falling in love with the wrong person could destroy your family's reputation, or worse, its fortune. A nobleman's daughter who refused her arranged match in favor of a charming stable boy might find herself locked in a convent. Her love story cut short by iron gates and vows of silence. And while the wealthy used marriage to trade land and power, the poor didn't fare much better. In villages and towns, marriages were often arranged by parents, based on economic survival. A peasant family might marry their daughter to the son of a local miller not because she fancied him, but because he could offer bread or shared labor in the fields. Love, again, was something that happened after marriage, if at all. In some regions, the local lord had a say in your match. In feudal societies, peasants were legally tied to the land and its lord. If you wanted to marry someone from another estate or even a different village, you had to ask permission. Without it, your marriage might not be recognized, and the punishment for marrying without approval could range from fines to eviction. Then there were the dowries. A dowry was the money or goods that a bride's family had to provide to the groom or his family in order for the marriage to go forward. For poor families, this could be a massive burden. You might have to sell land, livestock, or even borrow money to marry off your daughter. No dowry, no marriage. In some towns, unmarried daughters became so expensive to support that families gave them to the church instead, where they would become none, not necessarily by choice, and yet the groom's family didn't always get the better deal. In wealthier households, a groom might be expected to provide a mourning gift, a kind of reverse dowry to the bride. This was supposed to ensure her security if he died. It was also a public demonstration that the marriage had been consummated. If it hadn't, trouble was coming, because that's another medieval obsession, consummation. A marriage wasn't truly valid until the couple had slept together. This wasn't just between them, it was often everyone's business. There are documented cases where noble couples were expected to prove the consummation, sometimes with witnesses standing just outside the bedchamber. In royal marriages, bedsheets were examined for stains. Midwives were called in. Gossip flowed freely. One noble bride in 5th, 10th century, Burgundy was considered defective when her marriage wasn't consummated on the first night. She was examined, publicly humiliated, and eventually annulled through no fault of her own. It didn't end there. In some parts of Europe, there were traditions so strange they feel fictional. In certain Germanic regions, it was customary for villagers to escort the newlyweds to bed, cheering or singing bawdy songs. In other cases, a bride might be led through town in her undergarments as part of the ceremony to symbolize her transfer. From her father's household to her husband's, again, dignity, privacy, and romance were not on the menu, even when couples did begin to love each other. The church's influence over marriage created constant stress. Marriage was considered a sacrament, a holy union not to be taken lightly. Divorce was almost impossible. If a husband was abusive, unfaithful, or simply absent, a woman had few options. She might separate from him physically, but she couldn't remarry. Annulments were rare, expensive, and typically available only to the wealthy. The church also dictated when you could get married. Certain days were off limits, Lent, Advent, and other major feast periods were considered inappropriate for marriage, especially for celebrations. So weddings had to be timed carefully. You also needed a priest's blessing, or the union wasn't considered valid. Yet, strangely, the church also recognized clandestine marriages, where couples simply declared their vows to each other in private, with no priest, no witnesses, and no celebration. This led to endless legal problems later, with couples disputing whether they were truly married or not. Let's not forget the age of marriage. While the church officially required girls to be at least 12 and boys 14, marriages happened earlier in practice. These early unions might not be consummated right away, but the betrothal was still binding. In noble circles, it was common for girls to be married off before puberty, then sent to live with their husband's family to be trained as a proper wife. The pressure to marry, and marry correctly, was enormous. Being unmarried past a certain age, especially for women, was a cause for concern. Spinsters were often viewed with suspicion, pitied, or mocked. Their singleness was seen not as a choice, but a failure. They were called leftover women, burdens, or even blamed for bringing bad luck to the family. Some communities passed laws to prevent too many single women from living alone, claiming they might tempt men into sin or become witches. For men, remaining unmarried too long was seen as irresponsible, a sign of selfishness or laziness. And yet, being married wasn't exactly relaxing either. Husbands were expected to provide for their wives completely. If they failed, they were mocked, challenged, or even punished by village councils. In some regions, an impotent husband could be taken to court by his wife, and if he couldn't prove his abilities in front of witnesses, yes, that happened, he might be publicly shamed or even excommunicated. So where does love fit into all this? Often, it didn't. In fact, the romantic stories we associate with medieval love knights pining for maidens, noble women falling for poets, tragic love from afar, were typically meant to exist outside of marriage. Courtly love, as it was an idealized and often platonic form of admiration, celebrated in poetry and song, but rarely found inside the confines of arranged marriage. It was escapism, not reality. To truly fall in love with your spouse was seen as a happy accident, not the goal. It might happen over time as some couples grew fond of each other. But for most, marriage began not with love, but with a contract, a blessing, a dowry, and a carefully timed public ceremony. So, next time someone tells you about the romance of medieval times, the chivalry, the courtship, the devotion, remember that for most people, marriage was not about love at all. It was about duty, lineage, land, and survival. And for the average medieval couple, happily ever after wasn't guaranteed. But staying together through silence, strain, or obligation absolutely was. The rule of silence in monasteries. Imagine a life where you're not allowed to speak, not just for a few hours, or as part of a quiet morning routine, but every single day for years, decades, perhaps even the rest of your life. Not because you've taken a vow of secrecy or joined a meditation retreat, but because silence itself is the law. That was the strange and often stifling reality of life in a medieval monastery. While medieval society outside the cloister was loud full of markets, bells, shouting vendors, noisy feasts, and clanging tools, the interior world of the monastery was its mirror opposite. Within the stone walls of these religious communities, a powerful and absolute rule governed daily life, the rule of silence. It was not just a suggestion or a guideline. It was quite literally spiritual policy. Most of these rules came from the rule of Saint Benedict, written in the 6th century and adopted by many monastic orders across Europe. This rule outlined how monks were to live, work, pray, eat, and yes, speak. Or rather, how they were not to speak. The idea behind the rule of silence was that speech distracted the soul. Words led to pride, gossip, vanity, argument, and waste. Silence, by contrast, encouraged reflection, humility, and discipline. The less you spoke, the more room there was for divine contemplation. In the medieval worldview, monks were supposed to remove themselves from worldly pleasures, and speech itself was often seen as one of those pleasures. So how did this work in practice? In most monasteries, complete silence was expected during certain parts of the day. These included prayer, times, meals, and the hours between dusk and dawn. Talking in the dormitory, for example, was strictly forbidden. So was conversation in the refectory, the dining hall where monks ate in silence, while one of their brothers stood at a lectern reading aloud from scripture or the lives of saints. It was a strange meal, the sound of chewing, the scrape of wooden bowls, and a lone voice reading stories of martyrdom while everyone else silently slurped their stew. But the silence didn't stop there. In stricter monasteries, even during work, monks were forbidden from speaking. This led to the development of monastic sign languages, nonverbal systems made up of gestures and facial expressions. These signs were surprisingly detailed. A monk could ask for bread, request help with a tool, or indicate that he needed to use the latrine, all without saying a word. The signs varied between monasteries, and they weren't standardized. A gesture that meant cheese in one abbey might mean soap in another. New initiates had to learn this silent vocabulary, much like learning a spoken language. This form of communication was allowed only when absolutely necessary. Idle chatter, even silent chatter, was still discouraged. And if a monk broke the silence, the consequences could be harsh. Depending on the order and the severity of the offense, a monk might be publicly shamed, forced to perform extra labor, denied food, or even made to wear a symbol of penance like a sackcloth robe or a placard announcing his failure. Chronic offenders could be exiled from communal meals or isolated from their brothers. Silence wasn't just a habit, it was a test of the soul's strength. The rules weren't identical everywhere. Different monastic orders had different levels of severity. The Cistercians were among the most strict, enforcing silence even during manual labor, while Benedictines allowed short, whispered speech during certain work hours. The Carthusians, perhaps the most extreme, required almost total silence, with monks spending most of their lives alone in individual cells, speaking only a few times per week, and only then in hushed tones during confession or spiritual direction. But even in more lenient monasteries, talking was always suspect. Monks were taught to speak only when their words served a clear purpose, usually religious instruction or confession. Conversation for pleasure, amusement, or self-expression was seen as a spiritual weakness. In some abbeys, monks were required to bow before speaking, or ask permission to utter a single sentence. Some kept written slates and passed notes rather. Then speak aloud. Visitors to monasteries were often shocked by the quiet. Pilgrims or nobles might arrive with announcements, questions, or gifts only to be met by a silent procession of hooded figures, their heads bowed, their mouths closed. Messages had to be relayed through designated spokespersons, often the prior or guest master, who was given permission to speak on behalf of the community. Everyone else stayed silent, even in the presence of royalty, and yet the silence wasn't always peaceful. For many monks, especially new ones, silence was one of the hardest parts of monastic life. Imagine leaving behind your family, your friends, your village, and entering a place where you're forbidden to speak. Your thoughts become your only companion. The silence could feel holy or suffocating. There are records of monks breaking, down in despair, asking to leave the cloister because they couldn't endure the isolation. Some became ill. Some went mad. In the quiet. Your thoughts grow loud. Every doubt, temptation, memory, and anxiety becomes sharper. And in a world where speech is forbidden, there's no easy way to unburden your mind. Confession helped, of course, but that was a formal ritual, not a conversation. There were no casual chats, no whispered jokes, no comforting reassurances. You bore your burdens in silence, or you didn't bear them at all. Even more oddly, there were monks who spent decades in this kind of silence without ever truly speaking again. Some took personal vows to remain mute for life, a kind of spiritual extremism. These men were admired for their discipline, but also feared for their intensity. They became ghost-like within the monastery, respected, but avoided, and yet, despite all this control, silence could also be broken in moments of crisis. If a fire broke out or if invaders breached the abbey walls, the rule of silence was immediately suspended. In times of plague, when monks died by the dozen, silence was replaced by the groans of the dying and the hurried prayers of the survivors. In these moments, the silence cracked and the vulnerability of the community was exposed. There's something profoundly human about the tension between silence and speech. We use words to build relationships, to express pain, to ask for help, stripping that away systematically, intentionally. And for life is one of the most intense forms of discipline ever devised. It demanded not just obedience, but total self-suppression to outsiders. Monastic silence seemed noble, even otherworldly. To insiders, it could be a heavy, invisible chain wrapped around the mouth, day and night. Today, monastic silence survives. In some communities, but it's less strict, more symbolic. Even the quietest orders now allow speech during work, study, and daily interaction. But for hundreds of years, in the medieval monastery, silence wasn't just golden, it was mandatory. Speaking too much could be a sin. Speaking at all could be a rebellion. And for those who took their vows seriously, silence became more than a rule, it became a way of life. The sumptuary laws, how dressing wrong could ruin you today. You might dress however you like. Want to wear designer clothes on a budget? Go ahead, prefer a t-shirt and jeans to a suit. No one can legally stop you. But in the medieval world, what you wore wasn't just a fashion statement. It was a legal matter, a rigid, sometimes cruel system of clothing regulations called sumptuary laws. And breaking these laws, even accidentally, could bring public shame. Heavy fines, or worse, the word sumptuary comes from the Latin sumptus, meaning expenditure. These were laws designed to control how much people spent on things like food, celebrations, and most famously clothing. But they weren't really about saving money, not for the people in charge. No, these laws were about something else entirely. Maintaining the social order. Medieval society was structured like a pyramid. At the top, the nobility. Below them, knights and gentry. Further down, merchants, artisans, peasants, laborers. Your place in this hierarchy was supposed to be visible. Everyone should be able to look at you and immediately know your status. And clothing was the quickest, easiest way to enforce that if a merchant became rich enough to afford silks, velvets, or bright dyes usually worn by nobles. That was seen as a threat. It blurred the lines. It gave the impression that a commoner was trying to look like someone above them, and that couldn't be allowed. Because if you looked like a lord, maybe you'd start acting like one. Maybe you'd demand power. Maybe others would start treating you with respect you hadn't earned. So governments began passing sumptuary laws that told people exactly what they could and could not wear. Down to the fabric, color, and even the length of a sleeve in England. Sumptuary laws became particularly detailed under Edward III in the 14th century. His ordinances stated that no one under the rank of knight could wear fur, silk, or cloth of gold. Servants were banned from wearing clothes that cost more than a certain amount. Even the color of clothing was regulated. Rich purples and crimsons were reserved for the aristocracy, while poor folk were expected to wear dull browns and grays. If you were caught wearing something above your station, the punishment could be humiliating. You might be forced to remove the item publicly. You might be fined more than a month's wages. In some towns, you could be paraded through the streets in your illegal garments before they were confiscated and burned. The regulations weren't just about clothing either. They extended to accessories and jewelry. Only noble women were allowed to wear certain types of headpieces, like elaborate horned hennons or veiled wimples with precious stones. Gold belts, jeweled brooches, and ornate buckles were restricted. 2. A wealthy merchant's wife who dared to wear a noble-style headdress might be called to court and told, in no uncertain terms, to remember her place. Even footwear wasn't safe. There was a brief and ridiculous trend in the 14th century, called the poulain, where shoes were made with long pointed toes that stretched inches beyond the foot. Nobles loved them. Soon, merchants and even servants began copying the style. In response, laws were passed limiting how long your shoe tips could be, depending on your rank. Nobles could have 12-inch tips. Merchants got 6. Everyone else 4, if they were lucky. Why did this matter so much? Because in medieval thinking, clothing reflected the soul. If you dressed above your rank, you were showing pride, vanity, and rebellion. Worse, it suggested you were challenging the natural order, a divine hierarchy that placed kings above lords, lords above commoners, and men above women. There was also a fear that luxury itself was dangerous. Authorities worried that, if common, people spent too much on clothes, they'd neglect their duties. A cook who dressed like a noble might think himself too good to scrub pots. A squire in flashy garments might grow arrogant and disrespectful. These weren't just social worries, they were treated as moral concerns often linked to religious teachings about modesty and humility. The church joined in too. Priests preached against vanity and extravagance, warning that dressing above one's station led to sin. Some even claimed that wearing the wrong clothes was a sign of demonic influence or impending doom. Sumptuary laws and sermons went hand in hand, reinforcing the idea that appearances weren't just surface level, they were deeply spiritual. For women, the restrictions were often even stricter. A woman's dress wasn't just a symbol of wealth, but of sexual propriety. If a woman wore a style considered too luxurious or revealing, say, tight sleeves, a low neckline, or bright colors, she could be accused of being immodest or, worse, promiscuous. In some cities, prostitutes were legally required to wear specific colors or badges to distinguish them from respectable women. In Florence, for example, sex workers were sometimes forced to wear yellow, a color associated with shame, but even respectable women were constantly walking a tightrope. Too plain, and they were mocked as poor or unkempt. Too stylish, and they risked violating the law. Wealthy merchant families often found themselves navigating these boundaries, carefully trying to show their status without crossing into forbidden fashion. It was an exhausting balancing act, and then came the tailors. Poor tailors. These skilled craftsmen were often stuck in the middle. If they made a garment that violated sumptuary laws, even if it was the customer's idea, they could be punished. 2. There are cases of tailors being fined or banned from working for creating gowns with too many buttons, or doublets with too much trim. In some towns, guilds were forced to police their own members, reporting any tailor who made illegal clothes. Enforcement of sumptuary laws was inconsistent. In times of peace, authorities might look the other way. But during political unrest or economic crises, crackdowns could be harsh. Rulers used clothing laws to reassert control, especially when the social hierarchy felt threatened. It all led to a strange and often unfair world, where what you wore could define your destiny. A peasant in rich clothing might be scorned, punished, or accused of theft. A merchant's daughter in a noble woman's veil could be called vain or even sinful. Fashion was not just style, it was surveillance. People watched one another's clothes constantly, not to admire, but to judge, categorize, and report. Of course, not everyone followed the rules. Wealthy commoners found ways to cheat bribing officials, hiding luxurious linings inside plain outer garments or using family crests to fake noble status. Some grew so rich they simply ignored the laws and dared anyone to stop them. But most people couldn't afford that risk. And so the rules held firm reinforced, not just by law, but by fear. By the Renaissance, sumptuary laws began to fall. Out of favor, they were hard to enforce, easy to mock, and increasingly seen as outdated. As cities grew, merchants gained more power, and fashion became a faster-moving, more global phenomenon. But during the heart of the medieval period, these laws were deadly serious. They shaped not just fashion, but the entire social fabric. So the next time you pick out an outfit for the day, think about this. If you were living in the 1300s, your choice of sleeve length or belt color might not just get you strange looks. It might get you dragged into court, fined a year's wages, or shamed before your entire village. Because in that world, the wrong dress could mean more than embarrassment, it could mean disaster. Curfews and bells you couldn't even walk at. Night in the modern world, the night is a time of freedom. People take late walks, visit 24-hour diners, go to night shifts, or simply step outside to enjoy a starry sky. Streetlights blaze. Shops stay open late. The world doesn't sleep all at once. But in the medieval world, nighttime was something else entirely. It was a period of restriction, darkness, and fear, not just because of what might be lurking in the shadows, but because of strict legal curfews enforced by bells, patrols, and punishment. Medieval cities were not designed for nightlife. There were no streetlights, no lit signage, and no illuminated sidewalks. Once the sun dipped below the horizon, the towns and villages of Europe went pitch black. The only light came from flickering candles, torches, or oil lamps if you could afford them. Most homes had only a hearth and a few rushlights. Public buildings might have a lantern at the entrance, but nothing resembling modern lighting existed. In such a world, darkness was more than inconvenience. It was a threat. To deal with this threat. Authorities established a system of curfews, a word derived from the Old French couvre-feu, meaning cover fire. The original purpose was practical. At nightfall, a bell would ring to remind citizens to cover their hearth fires, usually with a metal lid or a layer of ash. This was done to prevent accidental fires, since most medieval houses were made of wood and packed tightly together. One spark could destroy an entire street, but over time, the curfew bell became more than a fire warning. It evolved into a signal that the day was over, and the streets were no longer safe or legal to walk in. Once the bell rang, often at sundown or shortly after, it was expected that everyone returned to their homes. In many cities, being found outside after curfew without a good reason could get you arrested, fined, or even jailed. You were expected to shutter your windows, extinguish unnecessary lights, and remain inside until morning. The curfew wasn't just a guideline. It was a command backed by city law. Why such strictness? Part of it was about safety. In a world without police stations or surveillance cameras, nightfall brought risk. Thieves, drunkards, and violent gangs took advantage of the darkness. Roads outside city walls were haunted by bandits, while the alleyways within were the domain of cutpurses and footpads. Staying home was the best way to avoid trouble, or to avoid being mistaken for trouble yourself. But the curfew system also had a deeper, more controlling motive: surveillance of the population. Authorities wanted to know where people were and what they were doing. The fewer people out at night, the easier it was to catch a criminal or suppress a rebellion. In turbulent times, curfews were used as a form of political control. If the town was under stress, say, during a plague, a war, or a food riot, the curfew bell might ring earlier, sometimes before sunset. Certain cities went even further. In 14th century Paris, for example, special night watchmen were employed. To patrol the streets after dark, they carried clubs, lanterns, and the authority to detain anyone who couldn't prove their business. If they found you wandering without a torch or in the wrong part of town, you might be dragged off to jail until morning. And if you resisted, you risked injury or death. In London, the gates to the city were locked at night. That's right, actual gates. Medieval cities were often enclosed by stone walls with huge wooden doors. Once those doors were shut, no one could come or go. If you were trapped outside, you had to sleep in the fields or pay a bribe to a guard to sneak in. Traveling at night was dangerous anyway, so most people didn't even try. Even inns and taverns had limits. While some were allowed to stay open later than private homes, they still faced heavy regulation. If a tavern served guests past curfew without permission, it could be fined or shut down. Drunken behavior after dark was seen not just as a nuisance, but as a crime against public order. But what if you had a legitimate reason to be out? Well, then you needed a night pass or written permission. Some people, like physicians, midwives, or city messengers, could obtain these passes. Even then, they had to carry lanterns or torches and mount themselves to the watch. A lone figure creeping through the dark could be mistaken for a burglar or assassin, no matter how noble their cause. Nighttime, in medieval minds, was a time for demons heretics, and criminals, not honest citizens. There were even curfews for specific groups. Foreigners in medieval towns were often under stricter night restrictions than locals. In some cities, Jews were forbidden from walking the streets after dark at all. Similar restrictions were applied to outsiders, travelers, and sometimes women. A woman caught alone at night might be accused of being a prostitute even if she was simply returning from a sick relative's home. And the bells, always the bells. Each city or village had its own curfew bell, usually mounted in a church or town hall. These bells rang out daily, their tones familiar, almost comforting and yet ominous. Everyone knew what they meant. Bells rang for many things in medieval life fires, deaths, weddings, mass, but the curfew bell was a sound of closure, a reminder that the outside world was no longer yours. In some towns, the bell would ring twice. The first bell warned people that curfew was approaching. The second meant you'd better be indoors now or else. In monastic towns, it was tied to the religious clock. Curfew might align with Compline, the final prayer of the day. Either way, it was woven into the fabric of life. Children were taught to fear the time after the bell. Adults knew to finish their errands before it tolled. Of course, some people broke the rules. Young mucking for trouble, lovers sneaking through alleyways, poachers or smugglers. But if they were caught, they faced stiff penalties. Even nobles weren't immune, although they were more likely to be scolded than jailed. Over time, as cities grew and lanterns improved, curfews began to soften. Nightlife slowly returned, especially in larger cities like Venice, Florence, or Paris. Theaters opened, night markets flourished. But for centuries, the curfew bell remained a central part of urban life, a reminder that darkness belonged to someone else. So next time you take a stroll under the stars. Remember, in the medieval world, that walk could have gotten you arrested. The street would be dark, the gates locked, and the bell echoing through the sky would be your final warning. The day is over. The law sleeps with one eye open. Weird food laws, and when you could eat what you're hungry. You go to your kitchen. Maybe you want some meat or eggs. Maybe a bit of cheese or something fried. In the modern world, your food choices are mostly up to you. But in the medieval world, what you could eat and when wasn't just limited by your pantry. It was restricted by law, religion, rank, and even the day of the week, because medieval society was obsessed with controlling food. Not just how it was cooked or shared, but who was allowed to eat certain things, and when. These food laws were not only bizarre by today's standards, they could make life miserable if you weren't careful. Let's start with the most powerful influence on your diet, the church. Medieval Christianity imposed strict rules about fasting and abstinence, not just during Lent, but throughout the entire year. At its peak, the church calendar called for nearly half the year to be made up of fasting or non-meat days. That included not just Lent, but Fridays, Wednesdays, Advent, the eves of saints' days, and entire seasons when eating animal flesh was considered sinful, but meat didn't mean just beef or pork. It included chicken, duck, and even eggs, and dairy, because anything that came from animals with warm blood was considered indulgent. That meant on fast days, you couldn't have cheese, butter, milk, or your morning egg. Fish was fine because it came from water and had cold. Blood, but no rich sauces. No grease. No fondant. So what did people eat? They got creative. Monks were some of the best at this. In parts of Europe, beavers were declared fish because they lived in water. So were barnacle geese, which were thought to hatch from sea foam. Some monasteries claimed otters were acceptable, too. These legal fictions allowed people to eat meat during fasting seasons without technically breaking the rules. Meanwhile, the wealthy simply bent the rules. They had cooks who specialized in creating fake meat dishes, tofu-like almond paste shaped into fake eggs, fish molded into the appearance of roast chicken, and other culinary illusions. These were sometimes extravagant feasts disguised as pious meals, but the poor, they just had less to eat. Then there were laws about who could eat what kinds of food, especially when it came to luxury items in many towns. Sumptuary laws extended to food, much like they did with clothing. Certain ingredients were considered too rich or exotic for commoners. Spices like saffron, cinnamon, and cloves were seen as luxuries for the nobility. Peasants caught using them could be fined. If you served a dish considered too fancy, you might be accused of pretending to be above your station. Feasts were also regulated. If you were a merchant, you couldn't throw a banquet that rivaled a knight's. There were rules about how many courses you could serve, how many meats could be included, and what kind of wines were permitted. In some places, even the shape. And number of pastries at a wedding feast were dictated by law. Food was also tied to your job. Laborers were expected to eat simple meals, gruel, bread, cabbage, and salted fish. If a plowman was found feasting on roast venison and spiced wine, he might face questioning. Where had he gotten it? Had he poached it from the forest? Was he being too proud? And food wasn't just lawfully regulated, it was socially policed. Eating too much could mark you as gluttonous, a sin right up there with pride and lust. But eating too little could be seen as showing off your piety. Monks and nuns who fasted excessively were sometimes accused of vanity or heresy. The line between virtue and vice was razor thin, and it ran right through your dinner table. Even baking bread was regulated. In England, the assize of bread and ale, first enacted in 1266, determined the price and weight of loaves. Bakers had to follow strict guidelines or face punishment. If your bread was too light or you charged too much, you might be fined or even put in the pillory. Some bakers added chalk or sand to their loaves to bulk them up, which led to illnesses and scandals. The church considered this not just theft, but a sin against the body of Christ, since bread was used in the Eucharist. Ale had its own rules. Brewing was a serious job, especially for women, who were often the primary brewers in villages. These alewives had to meet specific standards. Bad ale could result in punishment, fines, or the public shame of having your batch poured out in front of your neighbors. Some towns required alewives to hang a broom outside their door when a new batch was ready, making them one of the earliest forms of regulated small business in Europe. One open a bakery or a tavern. Not so fast. You had to join a guild, get permission from local authorities, and agree to regular inspections. These inspections were often sudden, and if your pies were underfilled or your ale too weak, you could be shut down or worse dot, and if you were a traveler, things got even harder. Inns along medieval roads often served stale, overpriced food. Many travelers brought their own provisions, hoping to avoid both bad stew and high costs. But in some cities, bringing in your own food was illegal. You were expected to eat only what was taxed and approved by local markets. That led to a black market of bread, cheese, and wine hidden in saddlebags and cloaks. Even during celebrations, food had to follow rules. At major holidays like Easter or Michaelmas, certain animals were considered traditional, but only for those who could afford them. Geese, for example, were the go-to meal for Michaelmas in England. But if a tenant farmer dared to roast a goose, without permission from his lord, he might be accused of stealing status dot, and then there were food trials. In some towns, food that had caused illness or death was investigated like a crime. A spoiled meat pie that made someone sick could lead to the cook being fined or even publicly shamed. A deadly meal might be seen as intentional poisoning. Cooks had to be extremely careful, not just with hygiene, but with reputation. Let's not forget the table itself. Who you ate with, where you sat, and what kind of utensils you used were all governed by unspoken and sometimes spoken rules. Nobles sat at high tables, ate from trenchers made of bread or silver, and used multiple courses. Peasants sat on benches, shared bowls, and used fingers or wooden spoons. Forks were considered suspicious for a long time, effeminate, or foreign affectation. Eating too delicately could earn you mockery. Eating too greedily could mark you as sinful dot. So what did all this mean for everyday life? It meant that food, a basic human need, was surrounded by constant anxiety. Was this meat allowed today? Was this dish too fancy? Was that spice illegal? Was your bread the right weight? Did you eat too much or too little? Were you sitting in the right place at the table? Could you even afford to eat at all? In medieval society, hunger wasn't just about poverty. It was about navigating a maze of rules, expectations, and judgments. Food was fuel, yes, but also a spiritual test, a legal minefield, and a social performance dot. And if you got it wrong, even slightly, you weren't just a bad cook. You were a sinner, a lawbreaker, or a threat to the entire social order. Guild rules, why you couldn't just start a job in the modern world. If you want to start a career, you usually have a few options. You might go to school, apply for a job, start your own business, or offer your services online. The path might be hard, but it's open. In the medieval world, however, things were not so simple. In fact, they were downright restrictive. You couldn't just decide to become a blacksmith, a weaver, or a baker. You had to follow an intricate web of rules set by powerful organizations called guilds, and these rules controlled nearly every part of your working life. A guild was more than just a trade association. It was a legal institution, a social club, a religious group, and sometimes a political force. Every skilled trade, from goldsmiths to glaziers, tailors to tanners, was organized into a guild. If you weren't part of one, you weren't allowed to work. Full stop. These organizations claimed to protect the quality of goods, maintain fair prices, and uphold tradition. But in practice, they also controlled competition, enforced strict hierarchies, and locked people out of opportunities. Becoming a full member of a guild, called a master, wasn't just about talent. It required time, money, connections, and obedience to a rigid system. Let's say you wanted to be a shoemaker in a medieval city. You couldn't simply open a shop and start hammering leather. First, you had to become an apprentice, usually. At the age of 12 or 13, that meant you were bound by contract to a master shoemaker for 7 years or more. You lived with him, obeyed his rules, did chores, and watched him work. You might not touch tools for the first year. You'd sweep the floor, feed the animals, fetch water, and absorb everything through silence and repetition. Apprentices were often unpaid. In fact, your family might have to pay the master to take you on. You had few rights, little freedom, and no privacy. If you broke the rules, or if the master was cruel, you had few ways to complain. After those years, if you were lucky, you'd become a journeyman. This didn't mean you could journey wherever you liked. It meant you were now a qualified worker, but still not your own boss. You could earn wages, but only under the supervision of a master. You weren't allowed to set up your own workshop, and you couldn't sign contracts or take apprentices of your own dot to become a master. You had to pass several gatekeepers. First, you needed guild approval. That often meant being born to a master's family or marrying into one. Then you had to create a masterpiece, a perfectly crafted item judged by the guild elders. If it didn't meet their standards, you failed. If it did, you still had to pay a massive entrance fee, sometimes equal to years of wages. Even then, the guild might block you. Why? Because each city had limited licenses. Too many blacksmiths meant less profit for the existing masters. So guilds limited the number of shops allowed, and they were known to delay or deny new masters simply to protect their own wealth. Merit mattered less than connections and control, and these rules weren't optional. They were enforced by law. Cities and towns gave guilds legal authority. If you tried to operate outside the system, you could be fined, shut down, or even jailed. Selling shoes without being a guild member, that was a crime. You could have your tools confiscated and your shop boarded up. Guilds also controlled quality, sometimes to absurd degrees. In Paris, the Hatmakers Guild had rules about the precise number of stitches in a certain seam. In Florence, dyers could be fined if their blues weren't exactly the right shade. Tailors could be punished for making sleeves too long or collars too wide. Everything was standardized, regulated, and subject to inspection. Even business hours were controlled. In some cities, shops could only open at set times. Prices had to be consistent across members. Advertising wasn't allowed. And undercutting your competition, that could get you expelled. Guilds also had a strong religious element. Each guild had its patron saint, and members were expected to attend religious festivals, processions, and masses. Some guilds built their own chapels or altars. Failure to show up for a guild feast or mass could result in a fine. Religion and labor were intertwined, just another way the system bound people together in control. And if you were a woman, things got even trickier. In many cities, women were not allowed to become full guild members. Widows might inherit a husband's shop temporarily, but they were rarely granted the same rights. Some trades allowed women to participate informally, especially in textiles and brewing, but they were always second class. Guild records show women being paid less, given fewer rights, and being excluded from leadership roles entirely. Then there were the rural workers and outsiders. If you lived outside the city walls, you were often barred from guild membership. That meant even if you were an excellent carpenter, you couldn't sell your goods in the city market. You were labeled a stranger, a threat to the order. Your work was seen as suspect, even if it was better than what the guildmasters produced. This created a system where skill wasn't the only factor in success. Often, it wasn't even the main factor. You needed a sponsor, family connections, financial backing, and years of obedience. It was protectionism in its purest form, but it wasn't all bad. For those who made it to the top, guilds provided stability. Masters looked after one another. If you fell ill or died, the guild might support your family. They paid for funerals, held banquets, and helped enforce trade secrets. There was pride in being a guild member, an identity passed from father to son. Guilds also trained generations of skilled craftsmen. They preserved traditions, upheld standards, and created beautiful, lasting works of art, metal, cloth, and wood. The problem was, they did all this by creating a closed loop, a system that favored the few, and blocked the rest out. So imagine you're a talented young blacksmith. You've taught yourself the craft. You've even made a few fine swords, but without guild membership, none of it matters. You're illegal. You can't sell your blades. You can't open a shop. You can't hire help. The system will crush. It not because you're bad, but because you're unauthorized. That's the strange reality of medieval work. It wasn't just about doing your job well. It was about being allowed to exist within the rules, a structure that often had more to do with power than productivity. In the end, the guilds were a medieval paradox, institutions that protected workers and restricted them, that preserved tradition but punished innovation, that offered security but only to those who could get past the gate. And if you couldn't, you weren't just unemployed, you were illegal. Marriage permissions and the rule of consent. Sort of in the modern world, the idea of marriage is wrapped up in personal choice. Two people fall in love, agree to build a life together, and ideally get married when and how they choose. But in the medieval world, marriage was rarely that simple. It was an institution governed by a tangle of laws, religious expectations, social customs, and perhaps most frustratingly, permissions. You couldn't just marry anyone. You couldn't even get married without the right people signing off. In fact, under medieval law, marriage wasn't always about love at all. It was a contract, and like any contract in the Middle Ages, it was tightly controlled. Let's begin with the concept of consent. Technically, the church taught that marriage had to be based on the mutual consent of both parties. In theory, this meant that if a man and a woman said to each other, "I take you as my husband," or "I take you as my wife," with witnesses present, they were legally and spiritually married. No priest, no paperwork, no party required. This type of arrangement was called a clandestine marriage, and it was shockingly common. It might happen between two young lovers in a field, whispered under a tree, or in a tavern over drinks, or even at the edge of a village where no one would see. In the eyes of the church, as long as both parties were of age 12 for girls, 14 for boys, and truly meant what they said, the marriage was valid. But in practice, this kind of freedom created chaos. Families hated clandestine marriages because they cut them out of the process. Nobles, in particular, wanted to control who their children married, since marriages often involved land, money, and alliances. Peasant families wanted to protect inheritances and keep local peace. Even village priests preferred proper ceremonies, since they brought in fees, tithes, and a sense of order. So even though consent was technically required, permission was often. More important, and lack of it could ruin everything. If you were a serf, for example, bound to the land and your lord, you couldn't marry outside your manor without permission. That's right. If you lived on one estate and wanted to marry someone from another village, you had to ask your lord's approval. And that approval usually came at a cost, a fine or fee called a merchant. Sometimes the lord would deny it altogether. Maybe he didn't want you to leave the manor and take your labor elsewhere. Maybe he wanted to arrange your marriage to someone within his control. The result? Your personal life was dictated by feudal politics. For noble families, the stakes were even higher. A daughter's hand in marriage might be promised at birth, not to a person, but to a political purpose. Her dowry land, livestock, wealth was often planned out years in advance. Her personal wishes didn't matter. In fact, some noble women were married off while still children, their future sealed before they ever met their husband. Sons had more flexibility, but not much. A nobleman's marriage was expected to expand family alliances, not fulfill romantic desires. If a young lord married a woman without a title or sufficient dowry, he could be disowned or demoted. A bad marriage could mean lost land, political enemies, or financial disaster. These were not just families, they were dynasties. And marriages were part of the long game. But even among peasants and townsfolk, the idea of freely choosing your spouse was a bit of a myth. Villages were small, communities were tight, everyone knew everyone. Gossip could destroy a courtship. A disapproving father could shut things down. A reputation, once stained, was hard to clean. That's where marriage bans came in. Bans were public announcements, usually read aloud in church on 3 successive Sundays, declaring a couple's intention to marry. This gave the community a chance to speak up if there was a legal or moral reason the marriage shouldn't happen. Were they too closely related? Was one of them already married? Was someone hiding a scandal or trying to marry a minor? The bans were meant to ensure transparency, but they also acted as a public forum for interference. If someone objected, the wedding was put on hold. In some cases, it might be canceled altogether. You could appeal to the bishop, but that meant more delays, more scrutiny, and sometimes more bribes, and let's not forget the issue of consanguinity. A word that sounds complicated because this was the rule that said you couldn't marry someone too closely related to you. But in medieval times, too close could mean as distant as seventh cousins. The church banned marriages within 7 degrees of kinship for centuries. This was later reduced to 4, but it still meant that in small towns, almost everyone was technically related. Couples had to seek special dispensations, and these weren't always granted. The process of proving you were far enough apart or convincing. The church to overlook it was exhausting, especially if you didn't read or write, especially if you lived far from a bishop or couldn't afford the fee, and even if you got through all the legal hurdles. There was still the matter of bride price, dowry, and social approval. A dowry wasn't just a gift. It was proof of value. It might include land, livestock, clothing, or cash. Without a dowry, a woman might find herself unmarriable. Meanwhile, the groom often had to provide a bride price, a sum of money or goods paid to the bride's family as compensation for her labor and worth. Negotiating these terms could take months. In some cases, the marriage agreement was more detailed than a land deed. So imagine being a young couple in love. You want to get married, but you need permission from both families, approval from the lord of your manor, if you're a serf, a paid merchant fee. Public bans declared 3 times, proof you're not related too closely. Dowry agreements negotiated and signed. A church ceremony scheduled with witnesses, and absolutely no objections from the community one mistake. and the whole thing could fall apart. If a wedding was found to be invalid, the couple could be excommunicated. Any children they had would be considered illegitimate, and that meant no inheritance. In a world where land was life, legitimacy mattered. A lot, and yet people found ways to marry. Some did it in secret, risking scandal and sin. Some paid the right people and got through the maze. Others submitted to the system bending, waiting, hoping in the end. Marriage in the medieval world wasn't a private bond. It was a public transaction, a legal contract, a religious obligation, and a social performance. Love might be part of it, but it wasn't the priority. So the next time you hear wedding bells or see a couple exchanging vows, think of what it meant back then. Not just two people coming together, but two families calculating gain, two villages whispering in the pews, and a system full of rules, fees, and fears in that world. To get married wasn't just to say, I do. It was to say, I comply. Tithes and taxes, the price of being poor. If you've ever grumbled about paying taxes, you're not alone. But at least today, taxes are supposed to be proportional. You're taxed based on income, purchases, or property value, at least in theory. In the medieval world, however, taxes were often flat, relentless, and cruelly indifferent to poverty. And the worst part, you didn't just pay the king. You paid the church, your lord, your village, and sometimes even a random noble who happened to own the rights to your river or mill. This multi-layered system of tithes and taxes made life for the poor, especially peasants and serfs, a constant struggle to survive under a mountain of obligations. You weren't just working to feed your family. You were working to keep everyone else fed first. Let's start with the tithe, perhaps the most frustrating and inescapable payment of all. The tithe was a religious tax, supposedly amounting to 1/10 of all your income or produce. This wasn't optional. It was enforced by the church as a divine obligation. You were expected to give 1/10 of everything: grain, livestock, eggs, milk, wool, even your garden vegetables. If you harvested 10 sheaves of wheat, one belonged to the church. If your cow gave birth to 10 calves, one was owed. Didn't matter if you were barely getting by, and it wasn't like you could pay later. The tithe collector, often a local priest or appointed layman, would visit your farm and take the goods in person. Sometimes they'd bring a scale, weigh your grain, and haul away their share in a cart. Some villages even built tithe barns, massive structures just to store all the offerings taken from the community. If you refused or failed to pay, there were consequences. The church could excommunicate you, which not only jeopardized your soul, but made you a pariah. You could be taken to ecclesiastical court, fined, or shamed publicly. In extreme cases, your land might be seized. And remember, this was all done in the name of God. Then there were secular taxes, which varied by region, ruler, and mood. Some were regular, others were arbitrary. All were burdensome. You might be required to pay land tax to your lord, labor tax, where you worked days for free on the lord's estate, mill tax, where you had to use the lord's mill and pay a cut of your grain, bridge tolls. Even if the bridge was crumbling, river usage fees for fishing or water access, market tolls. Just to sell your own vegetables, marriage fees, known as merchants' death fees, where the Lord took your best animal when you died, and it didn't stop there. If the king needed money for a war, a crusade, or a wedding, he could impose a special levy. These were often called scutage or tallage, and they hit the poor hard. Whole villages could be taxed at once, and it was up to the villagers to figure out who paid what. This led to tension, disputes, and sometimes violence, and these taxes weren't based on what you earned. They were based on what the Lord thought you could afford. If you had a sturdy ox or a thatched roof in good condition, it was assumed you had extra, so you were charged more. Some lords hired stewards to inspect houses and adjust taxes based on things as petty as the number of hens in your yard or the thickness of your cloak. Paying these dues was difficult enough, but how you paid made things worse. Currency was often scarce in rural areas. Many peasants lived in a barter economy with little or no coin. But taxes demanded silver pennies, and if you didn't have any, you were in trouble. That meant you had to sell your goods, grain, eggs, wool, cheese at market, often at poor prices, just to scrape together the coins. Meanwhile, merchants and middlemen took their cut, and any delay might increase your debt. Speaking of debt, if you couldn't pay, you might take a loan. But medieval loans were dangerous. Interest was forbidden by the church, so lenders worked around this by charging fees or demanding labor as repayment. Some lenders were brutally predatory. A peasant who borrowed to pay taxes might find himself trapped in a cycle of debts that passed on to his children. And if taxes crushed your farm, there was no bailout, no assistance, no forgiveness. You might lose your land or be forced to sell tools, animals, or even your freedom. That's right, some peasants sold themselves into serfdom just to survive. Serfs were tied to the land, legally bound to a lord, and required to work in exchange for protection. But protection was theoretical. Taxes remained. And don't forget the fees for justice. If someone wronged you and you wanted to bring a complaint to court, you had to pay. Pay to file the complaint. Pay to summon the defendant. Pay the court officer. If you won, the other party might pay costs. But if you lost or the judge was corrupt, you were out of luck and out of money. Meanwhile, the rich weren't exactly suffering. Lords collected taxes and kept most of the profit. Nobles could tax their peasants, skip their own dues, and bribe their way out of royal levies. Clergy often lived well on tithes. Some bishops amassed vast wealth. The irony? The very institutions that preached humility, charity, and poverty often thrived on the backbreaking labor of the poor, dot to make it all worse. Taxation wasn't always consistent. New kings or lords might change the rates. Some imposed sudden inventory. Taxes where officials came to your home, counted your animals or goods, and taxed them on the spot. Others introduced hearth taxes based on the number of fires in your home. Some taxed windows or doors. A few taxed bachelorhood, pressuring men to marry and pay the appropriate marriage fees. All of this meant that a peasant family might live in constant financial anxiety. Even in good harvest years, you were never far from ruin. A late frost, a failed crop, or a sick cow could push you over the edge. And the tax collector didn't care. You owed what you owed. Some villages tried to resist. They petitioned for lower rates, hid their goods, or staged small rebellions. But these were dangerous. Rebellion was met with punishment fines, floggings, even executions. In England, the peasants' revolt of 1381 was triggered by rising taxes. Angry mobs marched on London, demanding change. For a moment, it seemed they might succeed, but the king betrayed them. Leaders were killed. The system remained. So the next time you open a paycheck and see a deduction, be thankful it's just a number. In medieval times, taxes weren't invisible. They walked into your house, took your food, measured your livestock, and left you wondering how you'd survive the winter. Because in that world, being poor didn't mean paying less. It meant paying. Always and never being done. Punishments for petty crimes. Why a loaf of bread could cost a hand. Picture this. You're cold, you're hungry, and your family hasn't eaten in 2 days. You walk past the market and see a warm, crusty loaf of bread sitting unattended for just a moment. You take it, you run. You're caught. What happens next? Today, maybe you'd face a small fine or a warning, perhaps even help from a shelter or a social worker. But in the medieval world, you might be beaten, branded, mutilated, or even killed. All for something as small as a loaf of bread. Medieval justice was notoriously harsh, especially when it came to petty crimes, those everyday, desperate, often nonviolent infractions committed by the poor, just trying to survive. And the punishments were not just severe. They were public, painful, and deliberately humiliating. The medieval view of justice wasn't focused on rehabilitation. There were no jails for minor offenses, no therapy, and no second chances. Instead, the goal was deterrence. Through fear, the logic was simple and brutal. If someone saw you being whipped through the streets or losing a hand for theft, They'd think twice before stealing. Justice was performance. And you were the actor? Let's take that stolen loaf of bread. If you were caught red-handed, you might be flogged in the marketplace, stripped to the waist and whipped with cords or leather thongs, placed in the stocks, with your legs locked in wooden holes for hours or days, exposed to weather and taunts. Pilloried, your head and hands clamped in a frame, while passers-by pelted you with rotten food, dung, or stones. Branded, with a hot iron on your palm, your forehead, or your cheek, so everyone would know what you had done. Or, in some cases, lose a finger, a hand, or even an ear, sliced off cleanly as punishment and permanent reminder. These punishments were often carried out in public squares. Timed to coincide with market days when crowds were largest. Children watched. Priests prayed. The town crier read your crime aloud. The spectacle was part of the sentence. Even repeat offenders of petty crimes could face death. Under the infamous Bloody Code in later centuries, but rooted in medieval law stealing goods. Worth more than a few pennies could be a capital offense, no matter your reason. No matter if it was your first offense, and it wasn't just theft. A wide array of minor infractions could earn medieval people serious punishment. Let's look at a few. Vagrancy. If you were homeless or unemployed and wandered into the wrong village, you could be arrested on suspicion of vagrancy. This wasn't just frowned upon, it was a crime. You might be whipped and driven from town. Repeat offenders could be jailed or forced into servitude. In some places, vagrants were branded with a V on their chest. Gossip and slander. Speaking ill of your neighbor could land you in serious trouble. Women accused of spreading rumors might be forced to wear a scold's bridle, an iron mask, or muzzle fitted with a metal plate that pressed down on the tongue. Others might be ducked in rivers or ponds, a humiliating form of punishment where the guilty party was tied to a chair or beam and plunged repeatedly into cold water. Selling bad goods. A baker who underweighted his loaves could be paraded through the streets with his bread tied around his neck. A merchant caught selling spoiled meat might be fined, pilloried, or have their goods burned in public. Breaking curfew. Being out after the bell could lead to fines or beatings. If you were armed or appeared suspicious, the consequences were worse. Missing church. In deeply religious communities, skipping mass could be punished as a civic offense. Fines were common. In some regions, repeat offenders were shamed publicly, made to wear special garments or perform humiliating tasks in front of the congregation. Blasphemy. Speaking against the church or God was a serious matter. You might be forced to walk barefoot through town, carry a candle in penance, or worse. In some regions, a blasphemer could have their tongue pierced or cut, a grotesque punishment meant to silence sin, literally. And what if you had no way to pay a fine? Then came alternative punishments. You might be conscripted into forced labor digging ditches, hauling stone, repairing roads. You could be sent to work on the manor of a local lord. In some cases, if your crime was deemed bad enough, but not worthy of death, you'd be banished, expelled from the village, forbidden to return. Without protection or support, exile could be a death sentence in all but name. Children weren't spared either. If a child was caught stealing or begging unlawfully, they could be beaten or locked in a small cage, as an example. The logic of the time was clear. It's better to punish early than to allow crime to grow. Justice also varied widely by class. A nobleman who stole land might face a fine or temporary house arrest. A peasant who stole a chicken could lose a hand. The richer, you were the more lenient the punishment. Wealth could buy forgiveness, delay trials, or silence witnesses. Some punishments were designed more for shame than for pain. In parts of Europe, adulterers were paraded through the streets wearing nothing but their undergarments. People who failed to pay debts might be tied to a post with their IOU nailed to their forehead. A man who committed fraud might be forced to wear his stolen goods, fake jewelry, fine clothes as a mock costume, while children jeered Dot and then their trial by ordeal punishments, used in early medieval times before the rise of formal courts. A suspect might be made to carry a red-hot iron, plunge their arm into boiling water, or be thrown into a river. Surviving or healing quickly was seen as proof of innocence. These practices slowly faded by the 13th century, but remain part of the legal memory that punishment and pain were tools of truth. Still, the overwhelming theme in all this was clear: fear kept people in line. The law was not designed to reform, but to frighten, to show that order was more important than mercy, that authority would not be questioned, that property mattered more than people thought. So imagine you're a poor tenant farmer. You're hungry. Your children are crying. A merchant's cart passes by loaded with apples. You reach out, you take one. You're caught, and the cost? It might be your dignity. It might be your freedom. It might be your hand, because in the world of medieval justice, every crime had a price, and it was usually paid in pain. Dress codes and fashion laws. You are what you wear. Literally, today you can wear jeans and a t-shirt or a suit and tie, or even walk around in pajamas if that's your style. Unless you're attending a wedding or working a very specific job. Most people don't care what you wear, at least not officially. But in the medieval world, clothing wasn't just fashion. It was law, it was identity. It was a uniform that told everyone your class, your wealth, your gender, your job, and even your moral standing. And if you wore the wrong thing, you could be fined, shamed, or even arrested. This wasn't about modesty or public decency. It was about control. In medieval society, people were expected to look like their station. That meant sumptuary laws, legal codes that spelled out exactly who could wear what and when and how. These laws were not just suggestions. They were strict, detailed, and deeply enforced, especially in cities and towns where class lines were visible and sacred. Let's say you were a humble shoemaker. You might work hard, save money, and want to treat yourself to a fine velvet cloak. But if velvet was reserved for the nobility in your region, too bad. Wearing it would be illegal. You could be accused of dressing above your station, a crime that was considered both deceptive and dangerous. Because if everyone could wear silk, how would anyone tell a lord from a laborer? If a merchant dressed like a knight or a commoner, wore a bishop's purple, the entire social order would be at risk, or so the authorities claimed. Your outfit had to declare what you were, even before you spoke. Sumptuary laws listed specific fabrics, colors, accessories, and ornamentation, and who was allowed to use them. Silk was for nobles. In many places, commoners were forbidden from even owning it. Fur was reserved for the upper classes, especially rare furs like ermine, sable, or foxdot. Purple and crimson dyes were often banned for anyone below a certain rank. Because they were expensive and symbolically royal, gold and silver embroidery was off limits to anyone without a title. Even the length of your sleeves or the point of your shoes could be regulated. In 14th century England, laws limited how long a man's shoes could extend past his foot. Nobles got longer points. Commoners had to keep it modest. Why did this matter? Because medieval society was built like a human pyramid, with kings and clergy at the top and peasants at the bottom. Clothing made that hierarchy visible. If people started blending in, if a baker dressed like a baron, it could be interpreted as false representation or even social rebellion. It wasn't just about class. Profession mattered too. Butchers, tanners, bakers, and carpenters were expected to wear clothing appropriate to their trade, durable, clean, and unadorned. A cook wearing silk? Suspicious. A blacksmith in brocade? Laughable, and potentially fined. Even colors mattered. In some places, prostitutes were required to wear yellow hoods or specific badges to mark their profession. Jews were forced to wear identifying patches, hats or belts depending on region and century. Lepers had to wear bells. These markers were not fashion, they were enforced stigmas, broadcast through clothing. Religious rules added another layer. Monks wore robes made of coarse wool, typically brown or gray, to signify humility. Nuns wore black or white habits. Clergy were expected to avoid bright colors or luxurious fabrics. A priest caught in a flashy tunic might face censure from the bishop. A monk with dyed robes could be accused of vanity or pride, and for women, the rules were even stricter. A woman's outfit announced not just her status, but her chastity, her marital status, and her morality. Married women were expected to cover their hair in public. Widows were supposed to wear dark, modest clothing. Single women who wore elaborate veils or bright colors might be accused of being unladylike, or worse. Noble women were allowed more extravagance, but even then, they had to stay within prescribed limits or risk social condemnation. Certain accessories were loaded with meaning. A jeweled girdle could imply wealth or availability. A tight-fitting dress might raise eyebrows, and if it violated the church's idea of modesty, it could lead to public shaming or sermons from the pulpit. Sumptuary laws often targeted women's dress specifically, framing it as a matter of public morality. And unlike some laws that were enforced loosely, fashion rules were often policed aggressively, especially in cities. Guild officers, church officials, and even local informants might report on what someone was wearing. In Florence and Venice, official inspectors were appointed to walk the streets and find anyone in violation of the dress codes. In England, Parliament passed repeated laws in the 14th and 15th centuries targeting excessive apparel. These laws were often ignored by the rich, but strictly enforced on the poor. What was the penalty? It varied. You might be fined a month's wages for wearing silk as a commoner, forced to remove the garment in public, paraded through the town in your underclothes, summoned before a court in order never to wear certain items again, or simply have the offending clothing confiscated. Imagine buying a fancy belt at great cost, only to have it yanked off by a city official because it had too much metal thread. Or being stopped on your way to church because your cloak had too many pleats. These were not hypothetical scenarios. They happened often and were widely recorded in legal and church archives. Now consider how this impacted social mobility. Let's say you're a successful merchant. You've built a business. You've saved money. You want to dress well to reflect your success, but the laws say no because your birth, not your income, determines your right to luxury. Even if you could afford velvet, wearing it might earn you punishment. Your appearance had to match your origin, not your achievements. In this way, fashion laws became a form of cultural handcuffs. They stopped people from climbing the ladder too visibly. They froze society into its rigid shape. And the irony? The wealthiest and most powerful were the ones who broke the laws most frequently. Nobles routinely ignored restrictions. The king's favorites flaunted silks and furs. Clergy were known to wear jeweled slippers and golden rings. And when they were challenged, they either paid the fine or pulled rank. The laws, like so many in medieval life, were enforced downward, of course. People found ways around the rules. Some wore restricted clothing in private, away from prying eyes. Others dyed coarse fabrics to mimic expensive ones. Clever tailors used hidden seams and reversible garments to allow quick changes. A plain tunic might hide a luxurious lining. Shoes could be cut to look simpler on the outside. It was a quiet form of resistance, a small rebellion through stitches. Still, the fact remained. In the medieval world, your clothing wasn't just your style, it was your script. And every thread had meaning. To wear the wrong thing was to speak out of turn in a society that demanded silence from the lower ranks. So if you're ever annoyed by a school uniform or a work dress code, just remember, it could be worse. You could be whipped for your hat, or jailed for your shoes, or stripped of your dignity for daring to wear what you could afford. Because in that world, you were what you wore, and you wore what you were told. The rules that followed you to the grave. Medieval death customs. You might think that once you died in the Middle Ages, your troubles were over. But no death came with its own set of rules, customs, fees, and humiliations. In many ways, dying in medieval society was just the beginning of your next bureaucratic nightmare, one that affected your soul, your family, and your worldly goods. Because even in death, you didn't fully belong to yourself. First, let's talk about the rituals of death. When someone was dying, their final moments were governed by tradition. It wasn't just about saying goodbye, it was about dying correctly. You were expected to make confession, receive the last rites, and be absolved by a priest. This wasn't optional. Dying without the sacrament meant risking your soul's journey to heaven. It could also scandalize your family, who'd be judged for letting you die unprepared. But what if no priest was available? What if you died suddenly in battle or in the fields? Then your spiritual safety was in question. In some regions, sudden death was interpreted as divine punishment, a sign that you had lived in sin. People feared dying alone, not just for emotional reasons, but because it might leave your soul wandering, stuck in purgatory. This was a terrifying idea. It meant more suffering beyond the grave. Your family might try to fix it by paying for prayers or hiring monks to sing masses in your name. Yes, even the afterlife had a price tag. Once death occurred, the rules didn't stop the moment you died. Your property was no longer yours. Feudal custom kicked in, especially if you were a peasant or a serf. The lord of your manor often had first claim to your possessions. This was called the heriot. It usually meant giving the lord your best animal, tool, or garment, even if your family needed it to survive. Even if it meant your widow had no plow horse left. The law was the law. In some places, lords took everything, unless the deceased had made a proper will and paid the necessary fees to validate it. And many peasants were illiterate, or unaware of the legal steps, or simply too poor to secure a formal document. So their family might lose all their inheritance just like that. If the deceased had debts or unpaid taxes, and most people did, those came due immediately. The church might claim part of the estate in tithes. Local officials might seize goods to settle old fines. Even if you lived quietly, death could bring scrutiny, legal fights, and confiscation. And what about your body? It didn't automatically go in the ground. First, it had to be blessed and buried in consecrated ground, a churchyard. But space in the cemetery was limited, especially in towns. Wealthy families bought permanent plots, sometimes inside the church itself. But if you were poor, you might get a spot at the edge of the graveyard, and that spot wasn't necessarily forever. In fact, bones were often dug up after a few years to make room for new bodies. The remains might be moved to an ossuary or charnel house, a bony storage room, stacked with skulls and FEMURS. What if you couldn't afford burial fees? Then your body might be refused entirely, especially if you were excommunicated, a known sinner, or a criminal. Unclaimed bodies were often dumped in mass graves pits outside the town, barely marked, barely remembered. In times of famine or plague, the dead piled up. Burial became a rushed affair. But even then, people feared the consequences of bad death. Stories of restless spirits, ghostly punishments, and divine retribution circulated in every village. And don't forget, the church had a say in who could be buried where and how. Suicides were often denied Christian burial. So were heretics, witches, and the excommunicated. Their bodies might be buried at crossroads, with stakes through the chest to pin them down so they couldn't haunt the living. Yes, even. In death, social status and spiritual compliance still mattered. The funeral itself was another maze of rules. Depending on your wealth, it might include a procession through town, paid mourners. Yes, people were hired to cry, candle bearers, a funeral mass, a post-burial meal, and alms given to the poor in your name. All of this cost money. A lot of money. Families were expected to spend even when they had nothing. It was about honor, legacy, and salvation. Failure to hold a respectable funeral could stain your name for generations. Even if you had lived a decent life, a cheap ore. Improper burial could ruin your reputation after death. And then there was the business of will enforcement. In theory, wills gave you some control over your belongings, but in practice, enforcing them was difficult. Clergy might override your wishes, especially if they believed part of your estate should go to the church. Local officials might interpret your will in ways that favored the powerful. And if you had no sons or male heirs, your property might revert to your lord or the crown. Women especially had little say. A widow could be married off quickly by her family or lord, sometimes before the burial was even cold. Her dowry might be reclaimed by her birth family or swallowed by her husband's estate. In some cases, grieving widows were fined for trying. To leave the manor or refusing remarriage, even death didn't guarantee freedom for those left behind. What about commemoration? Wealthy families might commission tombs, inscriptions, or stained glass windows. Some built chantry chapels, where priests would be paid to pray for their souls daily. These were medieval versions of post-death insurance eternal credit payments to heaven. But for the vast majority, there was no marker, no stone, no record. Your name vanished. Your grave reused. Your memory kept alive only by those who knew. When they died, so did your legacy die, and even centuries after death, rules still followed. When churchyards became overcrowded or churches needed renovation, old graves were disturbed. Skeletons were removed, crushed, sorted. Some were repurposed into art. If you visit European ossuaries today, you'll see towers of skulls, rib cages arranged in patterns, bones stacked like firewood, all former people, whose rest was neither eternal nor respected. So, in summary, death in the Middle Ages didn't bring peace. It brought fees, rituals, expectations, bureaucracy, and exploitation. The church demanded its cut. The Lord demanded his. Society demanded the performance. And your family, already grieving, had to navigate it all back because in the medieval world, dying wasn't the end. It was just another rule-bound chapter. And even the grave had terms and conditions.